A routine commute aboard a public train transformed into a scene of incomprehensible horror when a woman, Iryna, was fatally stabbed in what witnesses described as a random and unprovoked attack. The aftermath, captured in a series of newly released and deeply disturbing 911 audio recordings, reveals the final, desperate moments of her life through the panicked and grief-stricken voices of those who were there, painting a grim tableau of a bloody and hopeless situation that has since sparked widespread debate about public safety, the justice system, and the threshold for capital punishment. Asterisk. Don't forget to write in the comments where and when you followed us on this mysterious journey, and subscribe for more unsolved events. Asterisk. The sequence of events leading to the tragedy began with an act so mundane it would scarcely register in the memory of a typical day. A woman named Iryna, who had journeyed to the United States from Ukraine in pursuit of a better and safer existence, boarded a public transport train, navigating the familiar process of finding a place to sit among the other passengers. She was a person working 2 jobs, piecing together a new life far from a war-torn homeland. And on this particular day, her simple act of settling into a seat for her journey was entirely unremarkable. Video footage obtained from the train's surveillance system documents her entrance into the car, a brief scan of the available seating, and her choice to occupy a spot that, through a cruel turn of fate, positioned her directly in front of the individual who would abruptly end her life. The recording shows her minding her own business, a portrait of a commuter lost in her own world, a momentary anonymity that is the hallmark of urban transit. Behind her, however, another passenger's attention was fixed upon her with an intensity that, in retrospect, appears predatory. The video captures him staring at her, an unwavering gaze that commentators later described as akin to a wolf watching its prey, a silent and unsettling prelude to the violence that was to follow. This individual, later identified as a man with a lengthy history of arrests, sat observing her, his presence a quiet and menacing counterpoint to the routine normalcy of the scene. Asterisk. For a period, nothing overtly threatening occurred, yet the surveillance footage reveals a subtle shift in the man's demeanor. He began to fidget, his movements growing more pronounced as he seemed to be searching for something within his pockets. This act, which could have been dismissed as simple restlessness, was the beginning of a deliberate and catastrophic sequence. Legal analysts and commentators, upon reviewing the footage, would later dissect these moments frame by frame, identifying them as the critical window during which criminal intent was formed. The law, as they would explain, does not require a long, drawn-out period of planning for premeditation to be established. It can, in fact, crystallize in the blink of an eye, in a fraction of a moment. The suspect's actions provided a chilling, real-time illustration of this legal principle. He was seen fumbling inside his clothing, his hand eventually emerging with a folding knife. The act of retrieving the weapon was not swift or seamless. It was a process that took several seconds, a tangible duration of time during which a decision was being irrevocably made. He then proceeded to unfold the blade, a small but significant action that transformed a concealed object into an accessible weapon. The metallic glint of the blade is visible in some of the footage, a stark and ominous detail. He then positioned the knife in his hand, a final preparatory motion before he began to rise from his seat. Asterisk. The entire process, from the initial fidgeting to the unfolding of the blade, was captured by the silent, impartial eye of the camera, creating an irrefutable record of his deliberate actions. In those few seconds, a public train car was converted into a stage for an impending act of extreme violence. Iryna remained oblivious, her back to the man, unaware of the lethal intent solidifying just inches away from her. The other passengers, scattered throughout the car, were also seemingly unaware, each absorbed in their own thoughts, music, or conversations, the collective hum of a commute yet to be shattered. A close-up view from one camera angle focuses on the suspect's hands, showing with stark clarity the knife being opened and held at the ready. This specific piece of video evidence would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, presented as undeniable proof of a conscious and calculated decision to inflict harm. The time it took for him to dig the knife out of his pocket, to use his fingers to open the blade, and to shift his body into a position to strike was more than sufficient, in a legal sense, to demonstrate premeditation. The man's gaze never wavered from Iryna as he prepared the weapon, his focus absolute. When he finally stood up, the casual atmosphere of the train car was permanently fractured, and the final moments of Iryna's life began to unfold before a crowd of witnesses who were about to be thrust into a scene of unimaginable horror. The recorded visuals offer a silent, cold testament to the fragility of peace in a public space. The immediate aftermath of the attack was a chaotic torrent of panic and disbelief, a scene of profound horror that was communicated to the outside world through a series of frantic 911 calls. The audio from these calls, stripped of any visual context, provides a harrowing and visceral account of the seconds and minutes following the stabbing, capturing the raw, unfiltered reactions of those who witnessed the event. One of the most impactful of these calls came from a man whose voice trembled with a mixture of shock and profound sorrow. He identified himself as having been standing right beside Iryna when she was assaulted, and his words were punctuated by audible sobs, the sound of a grown man weeping as he struggled to process the brutality he had just observed. He managed to convey the essential, horrifying fact of the mature woman had been stabbed, seemingly for no reason at all, but the emotional weight of his experience was palpable in every broken syllable. Forensic psychologists and legal experts would later analyze this call, noting that the witness's emotional state served as a powerful proxy for the jury. His tears and distress would allow them to empathize with the sheer terror of the moment, to feel, in a small way, what it was like to be there. The man's anguish was a testament to the deep psychological trauma inflicted not only upon the victim, but also upon those who were unfortunate enough to be present, forever burdened by the memory of what they saw. His nightmares, as one commentator somberly noted, would likely last a lifetime. Another 911 call was placed by a medic who happened to be on the train, and her professional background lent a different, yet equally disturbing, quality to her report. Her tone was not one of overt panic, but of a grim, measured resignation. She described the scene in stark terms. A woman was on the ground, there was a significant amount of blood, and the other passengers were, in her words, freaking out. There was an absence of urgency in her voice that was chilling, a sense of hopelessness that suggested she, with her medical knowledge, understood the gravity of the victim's injuries and the slim chance of survival. This subtle but profound element of her call was deeply unsettling to those who later heard it, as it implied that Iryna's fate was already sealed. A medical examiner, Dr. Thomas Coyne, would later provide a clinical explanation for this perceived resignation. He detailed how a stab wound to the neck, particularly near the collarbone, could easily sever major blood vessels, like the carotid artery or even the aorta. The blood flow through these vessels is so rapid and voluminous, up to 3/4 of a liter per minute, that a person could bleed out half of their total blood volume in under 2 minutes. Applying effective pressure to such a wound is exceedingly difficult due to the location and the presence of the collarbone, making it almost impossible to stop the bleeding outside of a hospital setting. The medic on the train, witnessing the scene firsthand, would have recognized the futility of the situation. Her calm and methodical report to the dispatcher, a reflection of a terrible professional certainty. Further details from the calls painted a more complete, if gruesome, picture of the unfolding tragedy. One caller, who appeared to have some medical training, provided a particularly grim assessment, noting that the victim's pupils were blown out. Dr. Coyne explained that this observation was a clear indicator of a catastrophic loss of normal neurological function. With the blood supply to the brain severed by the injury to the carotid artery, the brain would be deprived of oxygen, leading to a rapid shutdown of its core functions, including the cranial nerves that control pupil response. This detail, relayed in the midst of chaos, spoke to the direness of Iryna's condition and the swiftness with which her life was slipping away. The callers also conveyed the collective response of the other passengers, describing how some were attempting to help by applying pressure to the wound, while others were simply screaming or in a state of shock. The audio captured the cacophony of the train car. Space that had been filled with the mundane sounds of a commute now echoed with the sounds of terror and despair. These recordings, taken together, form a powerful auditory mosaic of the event, documenting not just the physical violence, but the profound emotional and psychological impact on everyone who was there. They are a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary day can descend into an unimaginable nightmare, leaving behind a trail of trauma that extends far beyond the immediate victim. The disembodied voices from the train provide a different kind of evidence, one that chronicles the suspect's successful effort to create utter chaos. While the interior of the train car dissolved into a scene of chaotic and audible distress, the suspect's actions following the stabbing were characterized by a stark and unnerving composure, a methodical sequence of behaviors that would become a central focus of the subsequent legal proceedings. Surveillance footage captured him as he, along with the other passengers, waited for the train to come to a complete stop at the next station. He did not appear agitated or panicked. Instead, he stood with a quiet stillness, a figure of calm amidst the burgeoning hysteria. As the doors slid open, he navigated his exit with a deliberate and unhurried pace, carefully stepping around the spreading pool of blood on the floor, an action that suggested a conscious desire to avoid contaminating his shoes, a small but telling detail. Once on the platform, he did not break into a run or make any sudden movements that would draw attention to himself. He simply began to walk away, his gait even and measured, an attempt to dissolve into the anonymity of the crowd and the urban landscape. This calculated display of normalcy was, in itself, a form of concealment, an effort to project an image of a person with no reason to flee, a stark contradiction to the violent act he had just committed. A critical component of his attempt to evade capture involved altering his appearance, an act that demonstrated a clear understanding of the need to shed his identity as the perpetrator. Witnesses on the train had seen him wearing a distinct hoodie, a garment that was now spattered with the victim's blood. The video footage and subsequent 911 calls from observers on the platform documented his next series of actions. He removed the bloody hoodie, revealing a black t-shirt underneath, instantly changing the most prominent feature of his attire. He then wrapped the discarded hoodie around his hand. This action served a dual purpose, both of which pointed toward a rational, goal-oriented thought process. Primarily, it concealed the weapon and the blood on the garment itself. Secondarily, it served to cover a wound on his own hand, an injury that investigators, such as former homicide detective Ron Bateman, would later theorize was self. Bateman posited that the folding knife used in the attack was not a lock blade design, meaning the blade could have folded back upon the suspect's own fingers during the force of the stabbing, causing a significant cut. The blood dripping from his hand, which was visible on the train floor, was likely his own, and his wrapping of the hand was therefore not just an act of concealment, but also a crude form of first aid and a way to stop leaving a trail of his own blood. Each of these steps, calmly exiting the train, changing his visible clothing, and covering his wounded hand, collectively formed a compelling narrative of a person who was actively trying to get away with his crime. A demonstration of what the legal system refers to as consciousness of guilt. This interpretation, however, was not the only one offered. Veteran trial lawyer Randy Kessler, viewing the same evidence, proposed an alternative and profoundly different explanation for the suspect's behavior. He argued that the suspect's calm demeanor was not a sign of a clever criminal mind, but rather evidence of a deeply fractured one. From this perspective, the man's unhurried walk and detached actions were not an act of calculated evasion, but the result of a severe mental illness that rendered him incapable of comprehending the wrongfulness of his actions. Kessler suggested that the suspect was not blending in, but was simply existing in a state of psychosis, so detached from reality that he did not even realize what he had done. This argument would form the bedrock of the inevitable insanity defense, a legal strategy that seeks to reframe seemingly rational actions as the product of a disordered mind. The defense's narrative would posit that a person in the throes of a psychotic episode, perhaps hearing voices or acting under a delusion, might commit a violent act and then simply walk away, not out of a desire to escape justice, but because the moral and legal implications of the act do not register in their consciousness. Therefore, the very evidence that the prosecution would present as proof of guilt and intent the changing of the clothes. The calm exit the defense would attempt to recharacterize as symptoms of a profound and debilitating mental disease, transforming a flight from the scene into a journey with no destination, undertaken by a mind that was already lost. The ambiguity of his actions on the platform thus created the central battleground, upon which the legal fight for his fate would be waged. A conflict between two starkly opposing interpretations of human behavior in the immediate aftermath of an act of ultimate violence. The arrest of the suspect on the train platform, executed by police officers with weapons drawn, marked the swift conclusion of the immediate manhunt, but also served as the opening chapter in a much broader and more troubling inquiry into the series of systemic failures that preceded the fatal encounter. As the initial shock of the crime began to recede, a pressing question emerged and was echoed by public officials, victims' advocates, and a stunned community. How was an individual with such a long and well-documented history of criminal behavior and apparent mental instability in a position to commit such a random act of violence in a public space? The answer, it turned out, was found not in a single error, but in a cascade of administrative decisions, procedural breakdowns, and judicial judgments that, taken together, constructed the path that led him to Iryna on that fateful day. An examination of court records and public documents revealed that the suspect was not a newcomer to the criminal justice system. He was, in fact, intimately familiar with it, having accumulated a total of 14 arrests for a variety of offenses. This extensive rap sheet painted a picture of a person cycling repeatedly through the system. A pattern of behavior that included charges such as assault on a female, injury to property, and multiple instances of misusing the 911 emergency system. The most critical and scrutinized of these interactions with the law occurred just 3 weeks before he killed Iryna. In January of that year, following yet another arrest for misusing 911, the suspect appeared before Judge Teresa Stokes, in a decision that would later attract intense criticism. Judge Stokes chose to release him on a written promise to appear. This legal mechanism, also known as a personal recognizance bond, allowed him to walk out of custody without having to post any cash bail, based solely on his signature and a pledge to return for his future court date. This practice is often a component of broader criminal justice reform efforts, aimed at reducing pretrial incarceration for non-violent offenders who do not pose a flight risk. However, in this case, critics, including victims advocate Andy Kahn of Crime Stoppers, argued that applying such a lenient measure to a defendant with a lengthy rap sheet and a history that included violent behavior was a catastrophic mistake, conframed this single decision as emblematic of a nationwide problem. Citing statistics from his own work in Houston, where his organization had documented over 200 murders committed by defendants who had been released on personal recognizance bonds, he contended that the system was repeatedly and knowingly allowing dangerous individuals back into the community, prioritizing the rights of offenders over the safety of the public, with predictably tragic results. Compounding the controversy surrounding his release was the fact that there had been a clear recognition by the court of the suspect's potential mental health issues. As part of the proceedings in January, the court had ordered him to undergo a mental health evaluation. This was a crucial step, an opportunity for professional intervention that could have assessed his state of mind and potentially led to treatment or commitment. However, this critical safeguard failed completely. The suspect simply did not show up for the mandated evaluation, and there appeared to be no effective mechanism in place to enforce the judge's order. He remained free, his mental condition unevaluated and unaddressed, a known quantity with an unknown but significant risk profile. This lapse represented a profound failure of process, a breakdown in the system's ability to follow through on its own directives designed to mitigate danger. In the wake of Iryna's death, this series of events prompted a swift legislative response. The governor signed a new piece of legislation named Iryna's Law, a measure designed to curtail the discretionary power of judges in granting release to individuals with prior convictions for violent crimes, while supporters hailed it as a necessary step. The governor himself acknowledged that it was not a complete solution, merely a move in the right direction. The law, named after a victim of the system's failures, became another somber entry in a long list of statutes born from preventable tragedies, a reactive measure taken only after the cost of inaction had been paid with an innocent life. The legal proceedings that followed the suspect's arrest quickly pivoted from the question of who committed the crime, an issue rendered moot by the unambiguous surveillance video, the far more complex and nebulous question of why, a query that would be explored through the narrow and highly specific lens of the defendant's mental state. In the American legal system, this exploration is bifurcated into two distinct concepts: competency to stand trial and the insanity defense. These are not interchangeable terms. They address the defendant's mental condition at two different points in time and serve entirely different legal purposes. The initial and most immediate hurdle for the court was to determine the suspect's competency. This is a procedural issue, a question of present-day mental fitness. The legal standard is straightforward. For a trial to be considered fair, the defendant must possess a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings against him, and have the capacity to consult with his legal counsel with a reasonable degree of rational understanding. In essence, he must be able to assist in his own defense. If a defendant is found incompetent, the trial cannot proceed. He is typically sent to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment with the goal of restoring his competency, at which point the legal process can resume. For the defense team, a finding of incompetency offers a significant strategic advantage, primarily through the mechanism of delay. Veteran trial lawyers understand that time is often an ally of the accused. As months, or even years pass, the sharp edges of public outrage can soften, and the intense media focus on a case can dissipate. More tangibly, the prosecution's case can weaken over time. Witnesses' memories, which are often most vivid in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, can fade and become less reliable under cross-examination. In some instances, key witnesses may move away and become difficult to locate, or they may even pass away, rendering their testimony unavailable. The defense's initial motion, therefore, was to question their client's mental capacity, prompting the court to order an evaluation and effectively pausing the case's forward momentum. This procedural maneuver shifted the focus from the courtroom to the clinic, initiating a period of observation and assessment by forensic psychiatrists who were tasked with determining if the suspect could comprehend the gravity of his situation and communicate coherently with his attorneys. Should the suspect be found competent to stand trial, either initially or after a period of treatment. The defense's strategy would then shift to the second, more substantive mental health argument, the insanity defense. Unlike competency, which is concerned with the defendant's state of mind at the time of the trial, insanity is a retrospective assessment of his mental state at the exact moment the crime was committed. The legal standard for insanity varies by jurisdiction, but many states, including the one in which this case was tried, adhere to a version of the Manhattan Rule. This long-standing legal test, which originated in 19th century Great Britain, poses a deceptively simple question. At the time of the incident, was the defendant laboring under such a defect of reason, from a disease of the mind, as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing? Or, if he did know it, did he not know that what he was doing was wrong? Proving this is a high bar for the defense. It is not enough to show that the defendant has a diagnosed mental illness, such as schizophrenia, or that he was acting on an irresistible impulse. The defense must demonstrate that his mental illness was so severe that it rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions at that specific moment. This distinction is critical and sets the stage for a battle of the experts, where for both the prosecution and the defense will offer competing interpretations of the defendant's behavior, thoughts, and motivations, leaving a jury of laypeople to make a final determination on one of the most profound and difficult questions the law can ask. In direct opposition to the defense's anticipated narrative of a mind unmoored from reality, the prosecution began to meticulously assemble a case built upon the suspect's own actions, arguing that his behavior before, during, and after the stabbing provided a clear and compelling demonstration of his awareness that what he was doing was profoundly wrong. The state's argument hinged on the idea that intent and consciousness of guilt could be inferred from a sequence of deliberate and logical choices, even if those choices were made in a compressed time frame. The foundation of this argument was the surveillance footage from the moments leading up to the attack. Prosecutors highlighted the video showing the suspect fidgeting in his seat, a detail they presented not as random restlessness, but as the physical manifestation of a decision being made. The act of reaching into his pocket, retrieving the folding knife, and then using his hands to deliberately unfold the blade, was dissected as a multi-step process requiring concentration and fine motor skills. Actions inconsistent with an uncontrollable, disorganized psychotic break. Former homicide detective Ron Bateman emphasized this point, noting that a folding knife, unlike a fixed blade, requires a conscious, preparatory act to become a weapon. Those seconds spent opening the knife, he argued, represented a critical window of premeditation, a clear and undeniable opportunity for the suspect to form criminal intent. The prosecution further contended that the suspect's actions immediately following the stabbing were the most damning evidence against any claim of insanity. His behavior was not that of a person lost in a delusional state, who might remain at the scene in confusion or lash out indiscriminately. Instead, his actions were methodical and goal-oriented, focused entirely on escape and evasion. The act of removing his bloody hoodie was presented as a classic tactic to alter his appearance and discard incriminating evidence. Wrapping the garment around his hand was interpreted as a rational decision to conceal both the bloodstains and the cut on his own hand, demonstrating an understanding that these details linked him directly to the crime. His decision to walk calmly away from the train, rather than run, was framed as a calculated choice to avoid attracting the attention of police or bystanders. This level of self-control, prosecutors argued, was fundamentally at odds with the legal definition of insanity. He navigated the chaotic scene, got off at the next logical exit point, and attempted to blend in with his surroundings. All actions that pointed to a mind that was not only functioning, but was actively engaged in the process of self-preservation and covering its tracks. To bolster this interpretation of the physical evidence, the prosecution would also likely introduce testimony from psychological experts and evidence from the suspect's own communications. Forensic psychologist Karen Stark provided a potential preview of this line of argument when she analyzed a statement the suspect later made to his sister during a prison phone call. When his sister asked him why he did it, he reportedly replied, "She was reading my mind." Stark interpreted this not as evidence of a genuine delusion, but as a post hoc rationalization, an attempt to create an explanation for an act that he knew was wrong and required justification. The very act of concocting a reason, however bizarre, implies an underlying awareness that a reason is needed, which in turn suggests an understanding of having committed a transgression. Each of these individual pieces of evidence, the opening of the knife, the changing of the shirt, the calm exit, the subsequent rationalization would be woven together by the prosecution to create a tapestry of a deliberate and conscious criminal act. The state's case would ultimately ask the jury to look past the diagnosis of mental illness and focus on the suspect's observable behavior, to conclude that, on that day, his actions were not the product of a diseased mind unable to distinguish right from wrong, but of a criminal mind that knew exactly what it had done and was trying its best to get away with it. The 911 audio recordings, beyond their immediate function as a real-time chronicle of a violent event, served as a powerful and enduring record of the profound trauma inflicted upon the witnesses, transforming them from passive bystanders into active participants in the tragedy's narrative. The emotional content of these calls, particularly the raw and unfiltered anguish, provided a form of evidence that resonated on a deeply human level, far beyond the clinical presentation of video footage or the technical analysis of a crime scene. One of the most compelling pieces of this auditory evidence was the call from the man who was standing next to Iryna. His voice, breaking with sobs as he relayed the horror of what he had just seen, became a focal point for media analysis and public discussion. Legal commentators, like Randy Kessler, noted that such a recording is an incredibly potent tool for a prosecutor in a jury trial. He described audio as being worth 10,000 words, capable of creating an emotional impact that is almost impossible for a jury to disregard. The man's grief was not a second-hand account. It was a primary source document of the event's psychological toll. By hearing his distress, jurors would be invited to vicariously experience the terror and helplessness of the moment, to see the crime not as an abstract legal case, but as a brutal and personal violation. The witness, in his grief, effectively became the jury's representative inside the train car, his emotional reaction mirroring what any reasonable person would feel when confronted with such a scene. The psychological impact on the witnesses was further explored through the expert analysis of forensic psychologist Karen Stark. She identified the man's reaction as a classic manifestation of acute trauma, a psychological injury that would likely have long-lasting consequences, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. The fact that he was standing right beside her placed him in a zone of extreme proximity to the violence, amplifying the psychological impact. Stark's analysis extended to the other passengers as well, suggesting that anyone who witnessed the event would have been traumatized to some degree. The sudden and senseless nature of the attack, occurring in the mundane and supposedly safe environment of a public train, would shatter any sense of normalcy and security, leaving behind a residue of fear and anxiety. The 911 calls from other passengers, while perhaps less overtly emotional than the man's tearful report, still conveyed a sense of panic and collective shock, with voices overlapping as they tried to make sense of the chaos and communicate the urgent need for help. This collective trauma, captured in the fragmented and desperate pleas to dispatchers, underscored the far-reaching impact of the crime, illustrating how a single act of violence can ripple outward, touching the lives of many and leaving a permanent scar on the community's psyche. However, the response of the witnesses was not universally seen as heroic or even sympathetic. A deeply disturbing aspect of the incident, noted by Nancy Grace and other commentators, was the behavior of some passengers, who, instead of rushing to Iryna's aid, took out their cell phones and began recording her as she lay dying. This act, described as totally reprehensible, introduced a complex and unsettling dimension to the narrative of the witnesses. It raised profound questions about societal desensitization to violence, the ethics of citizen journalism, and the basic human impulse to help a person in distress. While some passengers did call for help, and at least one attempted to apply pressure to the wound, the image of others choosing to document the tragedy rather than intervene became a powerful and troubling symbol of a modern-day bystander effect, amplified by the ubiquitous presence of personal recording devices. This divergence in witness behavior, from the profound empathy of the weeping man to the detached documentation by others, painted a complicated picture of human response in the face of crisis. It served as a stark reminder that in the aftermath of violence, the lines between victim, witness, and even passive observer can become painfully and uncomfortably blurred, leaving behind a legacy of both shared trauma and profound moral questions. The legal and public discourse surrounding the case inevitably turned to the question of the appropriate punishment, a debate that was intensified by a specific and somewhat unusual aggravating circumstance. The murder occurred on a form of mass transit. This detail was not merely a matter of location in the legal framework of the jurisdiction. It was a statutory factor that automatically elevated the crime to a capital offense, making the suspect eligible for the death penalty. Trial lawyer Randy Kessler and host Nancy Grace engaged in a detailed discussion about the legal reasoning behind this classification, explaining that an attack on public transportation is viewed not just as a crime against an individual, but as an assault on a vital public institution and, by extension, on the government that operates it. The logic is analogous to why the murder of a police officer, a judge, or a high-ranking government official is often treated as a capital crime. These are not just individuals. They are symbols of societal order and authority. An attack on them is an attack on the very fabric of the state. Similarly, mass transit systems are essential arms of the government, critical infrastructure that allows a society to function. An act of violence on a bus or a train is an act that creates widespread public fear and chaos, undermining citizens' confidence in their ability to safely use essential public services. The law, therefore, treats such a crime with exceptional severity, not only to punish the offender, but also to send a powerful deterrent message that attacks on the public order will not be tolerated. The decision to seek the death penalty in this case, however, was not without its own set of complex legal requirements and procedural safeguards. The gravity of the ultimate punishment necessitates a heightened level of scrutiny and a more rigorous legal process than a non-capital case. One of the most critical of these requirements is the appointment of death-qualified lawyers for the defendant. Randy Kessler explained that this is a crucial uphill proofing measure. A death-qualified attorney is a lawyer who has met specific state requirements for experience in capital cases, typically having served as lead or co-counsel in a designated number of death penalty trials. This ensures that the defendant is represented by legal counsel, who is intimately familiar with the unique and complex procedures of a capital case, including the bifurcated trial structure, a guilt phase followed by a separate penalty phase, the rules governing the presentation of aggravating and mitigating evidence, and the specialized and often arcane body of appellate law that applies to death sentences. By providing the defendant with such experienced counsel, the state protects any subsequent conviction and sentence from being overturned on the grounds of ineffective assistance of counsel, a common basis for appeal in capital cases. This meticulous adherence to procedure is designed to ensure that, if a death sentence is imposed, it is the result of a fair and constitutionally sound legal fight. Asterisk. The prosecution's path to a death sentence would involve a two-stage trial. In the first stage, the guilt-innocence phase, they would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the suspect committed the murder with the requisite intent. Given the overwhelming video evidence, securing a conviction seemed highly probable. The real battle would be fought in the second stage, the penalty phase. Here, the jury, having already convicted the defendant, would be asked to weigh the aggravating factors presented by the prosecution against the mitigating factors presented by the defense. The prosecution's primary aggravating factor would be the statutory one that the murder occurred on mass transit. They would likely supplement this with other arguments, emphasizing the random and unprovoked nature of the attack and the vulnerability of the victim. The defense, in turn, would present a case for mitigation, focusing almost exclusively on the defendant's long history of mental illness. They would introduce evidence of his schizophrenia diagnosis, his prior hospitalizations, and expert testimony arguing that his mental disease, while perhaps not meeting the strict legal definition of insanity, significantly diminished his moral culpability for his actions. The jury would then be faced with a profound moral choice: to impose a sentence of life in prison without parole, or to recommend the ultimate punishment of death, a decision that would hinge on their collective judgment of whether the crime's heinousness and its threat to public order outweighed the mitigating circumstances of the defendant's troubled and disordered mind. Asterisk. The medical and forensic analysis of Iryna's final moments provided a stark and clinical counterpoint to the emotional chaos captured in the 911 calls, detailing the physiological cascade of events that led to her death with grim precision. Dr. Thomas Coyne, a chief medical examiner, offered a detailed breakdown of the injuries based on his viewing of the surveillance footage and his extensive professional experience. He identified the likely target of the stabbing as the area of the neck just above the collarbone, a region of the body that is densely packed with critical vascular structures. He explained that a knife blade penetrating this area would have a high probability of severing either the carotid artery, the primary vessel supplying blood to the brain, or one of the major branches of the aorta, the body's largest artery. The consequences of such an injury are immediate and catastrophic. Dr. Coyne quantified the potential blood loss in stark terms, stating that these vessels carry blood at such a high volume and pressure that a person could lose as much as half of their total blood volume a couple of liters in less than 2 minutes. He described the process in visceral detail, with every beat of the heart. Blood would not just flow, but would actively spurt out from the wound, making any attempt at first aid on the scene exceedingly difficult and likely futile. The collarbone acts as a physical barrier, preventing the application of direct and effective pressure needed to staunch the flow from a severed artery deep within the neck. This medical reality underpinned the sense of resignation heard in the voice of the medic, who called Nina. She would have instantly recognized the wound as almost certainly fatal, a situation where the window of time for effective intervention was vanishingly small. Asterisk. The forensic narrative also shed light on a specific and chilling detail relayed by one of the 911 callers: the observation that the victim's pupils were blown out. Dr. Coyne explained the profound neurological significance of this sign. The carotid arteries are the lifelines to the brain, delivering the oxygen-rich blood it needs to function. When these arteries are severed, the blood supply is cut off almost instantaneously. The brain, deprived of oxygen, begins to shut down within seconds. The cranial nerves, which are located in the brainstem and control functions like pupil response, cease to work correctly. Blown or fully dilated and non-reactive pupils are a classic clinical indicator of severe brain dysfunction or death, a sign that the central nervous system is no longer receiving the resources it needs to sustain consciousness or life. This small, observable detail, noticed by a bystander in the midst of chaos, provided a definitive medical timestamp on the tragedy, confirming that Iryna had lost normal neurological function very shortly after the attack. The combination of rapid, massive blood loss and the immediate cessation of blood flow to the brain meant that her death, while not instantaneous, was incredibly swift. She would have lost consciousness within a minute, the initial pain and terror giving way to a physiological shutdown from which there was no possibility of recovery. Dr. Coyne's testimony also addressed the question of Iryna's suffering, a point of deep concern for her family and the public. While many might hope for a death that was instantaneous and painless, the medical reality was more complex and harrowing. He stated that she certainly would have felt the physical pain of the stab wounds, and, as was evident from the video footage showing her looking down at her injury and then at her attacker, she would have experienced a sudden and overwhelming rush of fear and panic in the brief moments she remained conscious. The horror of realizing what was happening to her was a part of her final experience. This expert analysis stripped away any comforting illusions about the nature of her death, presenting it as a brutal and terrifying event, both physically and psychologically. The forensic details the location of the wound, the rate of blood loss, the neurological response collectively painted a complete and devastating picture of Iryna's final moments, transforming the abstract concept of a stabbing into a concrete and medically precise account of a body systematically and rapidly deprived of life. The science of her death confirmed the hopelessness of her situation, validating the raw emotional accounts of the witnesses, who could only watch as she bled out on the floor of the train. The tragedy of Iryna's death resonated far beyond the immediate circle of her family and the confines of the legal case, becoming a potent symbol within a larger, fiercely contested national debate about criminal justice reform, public safety, and the role of the judiciary. Her story was particularly poignant because she was an immigrant who had fled the violence and instability of a war-torn Ukraine, seeking refuge and a better life in the United States, only to be murdered in a random act of violence in a place she had come to for safety. This bitter irony was not lost on commentators and victims' advocates like Andy Kahn, who framed her death not as an isolated incident, but as a total cataclysmic criminal justice system failure. He argued that the suspect was the product of a broken system that repeatedly chose to release offenders back into the community without adequate supervision or intervention. The decision by Judge Teresa Stokes to release the suspect on a personal recognizance bond, despite his lengthy criminal record and a pending order for a mental health evaluation, became a flashpoint for intense criticism. Critics portrayed the judge as an embodiment of a lenient, reform-minded judicial philosophy that, in their view, prioritized the rights of criminals over the safety of law-abiding citizens. Reports highlighted the judge's past political affiliations and support for figures associated with the justice reform movement, using her actions in this case as a prime example of the movement's perceived failures and dangerous consequences. This narrative of a systemic failure was amplified by political commentators and news outlets, who used the case to launch a broader critique of what they saw as a dangerously permissive legal environment. They argued that policies such as no cash, bail, and the de-emphasis on pre-trial detention for non-violent offences had created a revolving door for career criminals, emboldening offenders and leaving the public vulnerable. The suspect, with his 14 prior arrests and his release on a simple written promise, became the poster child for this argument. The fact that he was a known quantity to the system, a man whose escalating and erratic behavior had been documented time and again, made his final, fatal act seem not just tragic, but utterly preventable. Andy Cohn's assertion that he was sick and tired of naming laws after dead people captured a deep-seated frustration with a system that seemed to only enact meaningful change in the wake of a high-profile tragedy. The newly passed Iryna's law, while a tangible legislative response, was seen by many as a somber and insufficient tribute, a reactive measure that could not undo the consequences of the failures that made it necessary. The case also brought into sharp focus the complex and often fraught intersection of mental illness and the criminal justice system, while the defense sought to frame the suspect's actions as the tragic outcome of a severe and untreated mental illness. Many in the public and in law enforcement saw this as an inadequate explanation, if not an outright excuse. The debate highlighted a fundamental tension. How does a society balance compassion and treatment for the mentally ill with the non-negotiable need to protect the public from violent behavior? The suspect had been in and out of mental hospitals, and the court had recognized his need for an evaluation, yet these measures had clearly failed to prevent the tragedy. This raised difficult questions about the adequacy of mental health services, the standards for involuntary commitment, and the system's ability to manage individuals who are both mentally ill and criminally dangerous. Ultimately, the death of Iryna became a multifaceted, cautionary tale. It was a story about an individual act of horrific violence, but it was also a story about judicial discretion, legislative policy, the limitations of mental health care, and the enduring and often painful search for a just and effective balance between reform and public safety. Her murder, committed on a public train in a city she had adopted as her new home, left an indelible mark on the community and became a rallying cry for those who believed the system had failed her at every turn. Human nature always seeks answers. We strive to illuminate every clue, every whisper, every dark corner. However, some questions left unanswered are, in fact, the truest answer. See you in the next unsolved case. **